Good afternoon and welcome to a Center on Global Energy Policy event on the Geopolitical Outlook for 2020 to 2021. My name is Richard Nephew. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, where I run a program that works on international security topics, looking at the various different ways in which energy, economic statecraft, and other things related to international security all interact and interrelate. I'm very pleased to help host this event here on a live stream that is going to bring to you the perspectives of a number of former U.S. government intelligence officials, people who've spent their careers looking at international affairs and security topics and attempting to identify important opportunities, risks, and activities for the United States government. And they're here to bring you their perspectives on geopolitical events. The host of today and your moderator will be Mike Dempsey, the former acting director of national intelligence and a non-resident fellow with the center and this program. Mike is now a retired career intelligence officer, having begun his time in the intelligence community in 1990 when he joined the Central Intelligence Agency. And since that time, he has served in a number of management and analytical positions there, including the Director of Office of Transnational Issues, Director of the Office of African, Latin American, and Global Issues, and Deputy Associate Director of CIA for Military Affairs. He's also served as Deputy CIA Representative to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was a Director of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. In 2014, though, he moved to the Office of the DNI, where he served as the Deputy Director of National Intelligence and as President Obama's primary intelligence briefer. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Mike to introduce his fellow panelists, offer a few remarks, and open our discussion. Mike?
Thank you very much, Richard. It's great to see everybody on a rainy day in DC. I assume the same in New York. As Richard mentioned, we're going to discuss global geopolitics over the course of the next 18 months. I'll introduce our distinguished panelists shortly. Some housekeeping first. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream, you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CGEP Live and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. I'm joined today with my distinguished group of panelists, and more importantly, my good friends. So first we have Halima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy, Global Research, RBC Capital Markets. We have Judd Devermont, Director of the Africa Program at CSIS and the former National Intelligence Officer for Africa. Marcus Garalauskas, former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea and a Scowcroft Center Senior Fellow. And Alan Pino, former National Intelligence Officer for the Near East. So it feels like we could actually have this meeting in the White House Situation Room and it would not be unfamiliar to anybody on the panel. As we meet today, I just want to mention up front, this follows a similar meeting we had last year at about the same time, right around Halloween. And I continue to be struck by the extent of the challenges, both foreign policy and national security, that the next administration is going to encounter. We'll hear from our panelists today about key flashpoints and looming crisis in their respective areas of expertise. And we could spend the entire period talking about hotspots. But there are some overarching critical questions that form the backdrop to these crises. And having served, as Richard said, both in government and in the private sector now for the last 2 years in the aerospace sector, I want to highlight a few that are top of mind to me and that I think are going to need more attention from either a second Trump or a first Biden administration. The first and the obvious one is COVID. After next week's election and as we prepare to enter 21, we're still going to face an incredible array of challenges from the pandemic. The implications of the virus on our society, on our work life, on our political and economic life, and the global economy. So I just want to highlight up front a few COVID-related data points to consider. It's clear as we meet here today that the pandemic is morphing into a global economic crisis. We have more than 100 million people that have been thrown into extreme poverty over the last year. Just look at the situation in South Asia, where the forecast is for an 8% GDP contraction, one of the region's worst ever. And that performance is being replicated in large swaths of Latin America, Africa, and other parts of the globe. In America, we just saw the data this morning on an incredibly strong third quarter GDP growth, more than 30%. But we are on track for a $3.1 trillion deficit this year, the highest as a share of the economy since 1945. And the question flowing from that, of course, is can we continue that level of deficit even at low interest rates that we have now and remain a dominant political actor globally? The pandemic has also raised serious questions about the role, capability, and capacity of the federal government. Is our government right-sized and with the appropriate capabilities, or is it something that's a frontier issue for the new administration, whether that's President Trump 2.0 or Biden 1.0? I'll note that I did some research quickly looking at the size of the federal workforce. When I joined the government in 1983, the civilian federal workforce was around 2 million employees, 2.1 roughly. It's the same number today. The difference is we have 100 million more Americans. So is that the right size? And is that something that needs to look at in the next 4 years? I'll also point out that we're spending still more than $100 billion on the global war on terror. And I know that that's a lot of complicated data that goes into that, but it's a lot. We're still spending nearly 20 billion a year in Afghanistan, and we're spending roughly 6 to 8 billion a year on the Center for Disease Control. So again, does that mix make sense to everybody on the call? A second question is, what role do we want to play the United States in the world? I asked that same question last year when I was here. Are we determined to promote liberal democracy, openness, human rights, free trade, global alliances, the Global Health Organization, World Trade Organization, and NATO? Have we benefited in the last several years from that engagement, the last several decades? Or have we ceded our influence and resources needlessly and been played for a sucker on the global stage? I can tell you from the outside looking in, America's answer to that question is incoherent. And again, I'm not blaming anybody for that. I'm just telling you that that swinging pendulum on our engagement from the world isn't easily understood overseas. A third question, what role do we want China to play, and what role does China want to play in the next decade? Is our decoupling inevitable and a military clash more likely now than it was several years ago? Or can we hopefully map a softer landing for our bilateral relationship? And then fourth, are we focusing on the right technologies that will have an outsized effect on each nation's future economic and national security? And here, are we talking and working with a clear purpose on issues ranging from artificial intelligence to microelectronics, synthetic biology, cyber, hypersonic and autonomous weapons development, global supply chains, and space? Are we going to lead and create a global set of norms governing developments in those areas? Or is this going to be a new version of the Wild West where our ability to create is far outstripping our ability to regulate? And then finally, is it likely that today's array of international challenges can go unaddressed for many more years without eventually spilling over our borders? If you go back and look at the tape from last year, I asked a question at this panel: were we collectively running out of time to get ahead of global health pandemics? I think we have the answer. But today, are we doing enough on global climate change, on meeting our global energy needs wisely, on understanding the root causes of domestic and international terrorism, or in combating the world's global refugee and displacement problem? I've watched that number for the last several years, and it goes up inexorably every year. We now have 80 million world citizens that are displaced. If you look at the conditions in a place like the Al-Hol camp in Syria on the Iraq border, we have to ask ourselves as an international community if we can tolerate that, or if we can expect at some point those kind of conditions to cause problems down the road for us. So while none of us are going to have the answers to that today, I do think you're going to hear from some world-class experts on really important parts of the world that the next administration is going to have to face. And as we focus on those near-term problems, we just have to give a thought to the broad structural problems that need to be addressed as well, the challenges. So I invite you, our audience, and our panelists to engage in the discussion today and in the days to come, and to leverage this world-class institution and program and its resources to think about the crisis at hand and the deeper challenges ahead. With that, I'll turn to our first panelist, who'll talk about the Middle East, Alan Pino.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Richard, nephew, in Colombia for inviting me to participate today. And I also wanted to thank Caitlin Norfleet for getting us all organized and making this work. I'm going to look at the Middle East in a broad way, and I want to highlight three dynamics that will shape the Middle East region in the next couple of years. But first, a little bit of scene setting to show the context in which these dynamics will play out. Where we are now in the region flows directly from the Arab uprisings and their aftermath. The uprisings brought hope for the emergence of democracies across the region, but only Tunisia has made a transition to democracy, and its success remains fragile. Elsewhere, we have witnessed seemingly endless civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Lebanon is now close to collapse politically and economically, and security is deteriorating. Iraq is divided along sectarian lines, has a weak economy, and a population angry over corruption, joblessness, and poor services. Other regimes have regained their footing with a combination of repression, increased monitoring of their populations, and cosmetic reforms to remain in power. Now, looking economically, in the decade between the Arab uprisings and the onset of COVID, the economic situation for many in the region has declined. One estimate has the number of poor in the region increasing from 1/5 to almost 1/3 of the populations across the Middle East outside of the Gulf countries. And COVID is, of course, having a severe negative economic impact. The UN projects a 5.7% decline in GDP this year in the region outside of the Gulf countries, who are facing declines of a lesser magnitude, and estimates that an additional 16 million people in the region could fall into poverty. So with this in mind, I want to turn to the three issues that I'd like to highlight. The first is regimes versus publics. Basically, despite the increased repression across the region and the horrors of the civil wars, the spirit of the Arab Spring remains alive, and we can expect protests pressing for political and economic reform, and possibly some resulting in regime change. The spirit of political activism emerged in full force in 2019 in Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq, with large sustained protest movements demanding change. The protests were forced into hibernation by COVID, but COVID is intensifying economic hardship, heightening popular frustrations, and compounding governance challenges across the region. A key challenge for the United States is likely to be how to navigate between the competing pressures from reform movements and governments, both seeking US backing. The second issue I want to highlight is the risk of escalating military conflict between Israel and its Saudi and UAE allies and Iran. And I would add to this the danger of a conflict between Iran and the US. Iran sees us in league with its regional adversaries and wants to break the chokehold of sanctions. Saudi Arabia and the UAE believe expansion of Iran's role in the region threatens them. And for example, their involvement in Yemen, the Yemen civil war, was largely aimed at countering Iran. Both have suffered attacks on their oil, infrastructure, and civilian targets from Iranian-backed Houthi rebels with weapons provided by Iran. The UAE normalization with Israel is partly aimed at strengthening their anti-Iran alliance, and the Saudis are cooperating with Israel more quietly and covertly. And as Israeli attacks against Iran in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere continue, Iran and its partner Hezbollah will respond more aggressively. Saudi Arabia and the UAE may be targets because of their ties to Israel and the US and their links to the US pressure campaign against Iran, and because they have the less ability than either Israel or the US to retaliate against Iran. As I mentioned, Israel has made clear that it's not going to tolerate Iran's presence and influence in Syria and Iraq and even Yemen, nor will it tolerate advances in Iran's nuclear weapons program. To give you an example of the Israeli attacks I've been referring to, over the last 3 years, I think we've seen over 200 in Syria. We've also seen against the Iranian presence there, we've seen attacks against Iran and its proxies in Iraq. And reportedly, Israel has been involved in sabotage operations against Iran nuclear facilities in Iran itself. As the Israeli attacks continue and perhaps ramp up, we can certainly expect that Iran will also step up its attacks against the US that it will step up its attacks against Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel, and the US may face pressure as well. If the US sanctions against Iran continue, we can certainly expect the kind of attacks that Iran carried out against us in 2019 and against Saudi Arabia's oil installations to pick up once again. The US will either need to be prepared to respond militarily to Iran and protect our allies, or seek a diplomatic path to reduce tensions. Finally, I want to touch on the issue of external intervention in conflict zones in the region, which has intensified and prolonged these conflicts and worsened the humanitarian impact and negative consequences for the region and beyond. In Syria, roughly half of the pre-war population is either internally displaced or living as refugees, putting significant economic and political burdens on host countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And of course, Europe has been profoundly affected by refugees coming from Syria. Yemen is suffering a massive humanitarian crisis, with many millions food insecure either food insecure, at the risk of starvation, or threatened by disease, in some cases, all three. Iran has exploited the conflicts in Syria and Yemen, and the fight against ISIS in Iraq to entrench its influence, create strategic depth, and pose a threat to Israel. Russia has emerged as a major power broker in Syria and used its role there to build influence and security and intelligence ties across the region. Russia's long-term presence in Libya in support of Field Marshal Haftar gives it an opportunity to secure a stake in Libyan energy resources and a military position on Europe's southern flank. Turkey is positioning itself as a major regional player through its role in Syria and its backing for the government of national accord in Libya. Turkey seeks to counter Kurdish aspirations in Syria, supports a role for Islamist political groups across the region, and is using its role in Libya to stake a claim to energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. To conclude with just 3 brief points, kind of summarizing, COVID is worsening Mideast economies, increasing the likelihood of future protests. 2, frictions between Israel, the Sunni Gulf states, and Iran risk spiraling into a wider conflict and potentially drawing in the US. And 3, US adversaries such as Russia and frenemies like Turkey are building influence in the region at the expense of the United States. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alan. Listening to your presentation, you reminded me that when I became the deputy director, I had blondish hair and I was gray by the end of it. Let me go next. I think I'm going to go to Judd. Why don't you talk about your area and give us some thoughts about what the new administration will face.
Great, thanks, Mike. And let me just add my thanks to you and to Richard and Caitlin and the Center for having me. In particular, I'm so delighted to be on a panel with so many friends and former colleagues. You know, the world moves so quickly, I think sometimes we don't have a chance to really take stock of what has changed. And on my beat, Sub-Saharan Africa, there's been some significant shifts. So I want to put 2 or 3 points on the board just for context before I give you an outlook. Starting with that, the democratic landscape has dramatically changed since 2015. We've seen 33 transfers of power, peaceful transfers of power in this region since 2015. 18 of those have been opposition defeats of ruling parties or ruling party candidates. At the same time, we're seeing African publics take to the streets in significant numbers demanding political and economic reform. The region has seen the largest increases in anti-government protests in the world, more than twice the global average. So, Alan, we'll have to do a trade on the Arab Spring versus Africa. Now, this doesn't mean that democracy is breaking out in Sub-Saharan Africa. What it means is that we're seeing some heightened contestation and real volatility around what are the new rules of the road between the governed and the governing. Africans are strongly in support of democracy, even while the world is in recession, with 68% of Africans supporting democracy, but it's still in short supply across the continent. The second key trend I want to talk about is that Africa is becoming a very crowded space. We are seeing US allies and adversaries working to plant their flags to advance economic security and political interests. And it's not just China. We can talk about China in the Q&A, but between 2010 and 2015, 150 new embassies were built by foreign actors. And the Gulf states, Turkey and India were really leading the pack. Before COVID, we saw trade with 65 countries in sub-Saharan Africa increase, some of them doubling and tripling, albeit from a low base. And then there's the 4 military bases cropping out all over the region, from the Sahel to the Indian Ocean to the Horn of Africa. I'm going to draw your attention to Djibouti, a small little country with less than 1 million people, but right on the Bab el Mandeb Straits. And so this is where we have a base, the US has a base, the French have the base, the Italians, the Japanese, the Saudis are building one, the Indians are looking to get on the Japanese base, and of course, China's only overseas military bases in Djibouti. So the sum of all of this is that you've got a lot more foreign entanglements for African countries, forced to make impossible choices in a period of heightened geopolitical rivalry between picking one side or the other. And yes, that's the US and China. It's also China and Taiwan, Israel and Palestine, Serbia and Kosovo, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. The last point I want to put on the board is COVID-19. Africa has actually weathered the health challenges fairly well, contrary to most expectations. 1.6 million infections, less than 20,000 deaths. That's not bad for a population of 1.3 billion. What COVID has really been is an economic crisis, just as Alan talked about for the Middle East. The region will enter recession for the first time in 25 years. And the most pressing issue right now is, will they get debt relief? Will they get bailouts that will help them weather the storm? The other thing that's really interesting about COVID-19 is it's become an arena for global competition in Africa. I've counted 22 non-African countries who are supporting relief and medical efforts. What's been really interesting, though, is that the Africans are pushing back on the international system for what they have, in quotes, have called selfishness. And this is the most public, critical, sustained I have ever seen Africans since the beginning of the Cold War, since the end of apartheid. And the two biggest countries in the world, the United States and China, have come under considerable fire from the Africans for racism in our country and in China, for being obstacles on debt relief, for China not having sort of complete or having faulty sort of support, and for the United States disparaging someone like Dr. Tedros, or just yesterday blocking Dr. Ngozi from being the new head of the WTO. So with a backdrop of contested politics, geopolitical rivalries, and COVID-19, what should the next administration deal with? I'll give you 3 sort of regions and countries that I think are most pressing. The transition in the Horn of Africa. What's going to happen in Ethiopia and Sudan are hugely consequential. These countries are at the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And if they turn the page, become democratic, it would be incredibly important for global security. In Ethiopia, the trend lines aren't great right now. Prime Minister Abiy, despite winning the Nobel Prize, has started to crack down his opposition. He can't manage the outbreak of ethnic violence across his country. And meanwhile, Ethiopia's rift with Egypt is looking really bad over the dam, made worse in part because President Trump recently publicly talked about how Egypt may bomb Ethiopia over this dam. So the next year, I think, will be decisive for a country of 100 million and the broader region. Similar in Sudan, significant progress since the dictator Omar al-Bashir left power. He was ousted by public protests. The military and the civilians are sharing power over a 39 transition period. There has been some gains, particularly the fact that the US just lifted, or said it was going to lift, the state sponsor of terrorism designation. That's very important. But really, the next administration has to roll up its sleeves to help this failing economy, and also to make sure that they're on track with the transition. Watch out for the military and the way it tries to build credibility in this transition period, and whether they will genuinely really hand over power at the end of the transition. Second region I want to talk about is the Sahel in northern Mozambique, where extremist threats are getting worse. In the Sahel, we're halfway through 2020, or at least halfway through 2020, more fatalities in the Sahel than the entirety of 2019. And the truth is, the international community has not done a rethink of its policy. It's the same plan over and over again. More money, more partners, more security operations. That hasn't been a winning strategy since the coup in Mali in 2013, and I'm not optimistic it's going to improve over the coming year. In Mozambique, maybe something that the audience doesn't pay attention to, but a small militant group linked to ISIS has now become much more effective, growing in sophistication, captured a key town, And despite this being near one of the largest LNG finds in the world, Halima can talk more about it, the Mozambique has made all sorts of strategic mistakes. They're not winning hearts and minds. They're committing human rights abuses. And the international community, despite having a very strong US nexus, really has not given this attention relative to other security challenges. Finally, democracy reversals and popular protests in West Africa. This was a region in the last decade that we lauded for its democratic progress, but now there's some serious regressions. And again, I think an inattentive international community. In Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea, we're seeing leaders either having won or about to win a third term. In Cote d'Ivoire, this could be the reversal of a post-Cold War, post-Civil War peace. There are upcoming elections in Burkina Faso, but because of insecurity, 5 out of the 13 regions won't even vote. And Niger, which is going to have a good transition, the leader's going to step down, but they're probably going to keep the opposition candidate disqualified until the 11th hour. And finally, I can't talk in a public setting without talking about Nigeria. This is the most important country for US strategic interests in sub-Saharan Africa. That's because it's the largest population on the continent. It will surpass the United States by 2045, largest economy, and it has the potential, at least in better days, to be a security exporter. But 20 years into democracy and 5 years after they had this opposition win, the country is really suffocating under the weight of an economic crisis, multiple security crisis, and now these SARS must end SARS protests, which I want to end on. These protests started earlier this month because they got on video this special police unit killing a Nigerian. And these young tech-savvy Nigerians hit the streets, shut down the commercial capital of Lagos. It was this defining moment until the military opened fire on them on October 20th. And so right now, I think we are at a standstill, and it's yet to be seen whether they'll be able to translate this into a real moment of change for the continent, for Nigeria. And the saying goes, where Nigeria goes, so does the continent. So I think the administration will really have to elevate its attention on this pivotal country. Thank you.
Thank you, Judd. It's fantastic. Okay, in the interest of time, we'll go right to Marcus, and you can give us some uplifting news about North Korea.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so I'm going to cover the broader East Asia. Since I've spent so much of my time being focused on North Korea, I've also had a chance to look at how it all fits together in the region, and I'm eager to talk about the broader issues beyond North Korea. So overall, I expect the geopolitical outlook in East Asia for the next 18 months is going to be dominated by 2 major elements. One, Kim Jong-un, and number 2, Xi Jinping, both separately pushing along different paths to change the status quo in their favor in different ways. Both will be facing significant domestic and external obstacles in this goal, and they're both going to be doing this while trying to minimize the risk of a major military conflict. And it's important to note, though, even though I talk about them together, that these efforts are really unlikely to be coordinated in any significant way. And although they may end up causing more complex dilemmas for the United States because they're happening simultaneously, in some ways, these efforts may even interfere with each other. And we can talk about that a little more as I go on. First and foremost, North Korea's effort to establish itself as a credible de facto nuclear armed state with a nuclear deterrent is likely to reach a whole new stage just within months, if not weeks, after the US election. And this is probably going to be the most immediate and obvious geopolitical phenomenon that you're going to see in East Asia over the next 18 months. This is going to force the administration, whoever is in office at the end of January, to deal with North Korea sooner than they would probably like. If the US government is willing to entertain accepting North Korea as a nuclear armed state, Kim might be able to achieve his goal, or at least some of his goals, without a confrontation. But absent that, I think North Korea is likely to try and force the issue with a series of missile tests and a renewed confrontation. And you can see behind me, I have an image from the North Korean military parade on the 10th of October. I'll move out of the way so you can see it, of a new, what has been dubbed monster missile that I expect will be part of this confrontation that the North Koreans will threaten to test and perhaps even test this new missile. And so that's really going to, I think, grab the headlines at some point in early 2021, if not in late 2020. But at the same time, while Beijing tries to manage these disruptions from North Korea in a way that promotes its interests and is going to try and position itself to take advantage of the situation, it's also going to be continuing its efforts to continue building its standing in the region and its global influence in competition with the United States. And although the Chinese Communist Party's next Congress is 2 years away in the October-November 2022 timeframe, I expect that setting the stage to show that she is an effective and strong leader is also going to be a big factor in Beijing's behavior for the next 18 months. And so as a result, rather than simply consolidating the gains of the last few years and absorbing the economic blow inflicted by COVID, I expect that she is going to seek to maintain momentum internationally, as he's probably grown more confident, maybe even overconfident, based on his perception, Chinese perception of US weakness. Now, based on what we've seen in Xi's decisions and heard from his statements in recent months, including some very revisionist statements, by the way, and aggressive statements about the Korean War, I'm skeptical that Xi realizes that the fears that he's stoking regionally and globally are actually probably generating more resistance internationally than they're resulting in additional respect and deference to China. Under Xi, China will probably amplify its pandemic performance relative to the United States and try and exaggerate essentially the effectiveness of its response, especially by promoting China's vaccine production and the multinational COVAX initiative. Now, beyond Taiwan, I expect that China is going to focus heavy pressure on South Korea. Perhaps by attempting to exploit any perception that the U.S. is sacrificing Seoul's interest in any way in comparison to Washington's in terms of how it deals with North Korea. This is going to be an effort to try and peel South Korea away from the United States while it's simultaneously also trying to intimidate Taiwan. Honestly, I expect these efforts to backfire and increasingly drive domestic support in both South Korea and Taiwan for responses to push back on China. But I don't think it's necessarily going to lead to either capital to place greater confidence in the U.S., particularly depending on how Washington behaves in the next 18 months. Though I'm fairly confident in these two overall assessments, I'll be honest, I'm far less confident in how this will actually play out. So much of it depends on how the U.S. and its friends and allies counter these efforts by Xi and Kim, and how much the resulting confrontations either escalate or stabilized. Probably not resolved, though, through diplomacy. The results of the U.S. presidential election, of course, are just one of the many variables that will shape the response to these efforts, since ultimately each government in the region has at least a slightly different calculus toward North Korea and China separately. However, I do expect there's going to be three main results that we've already sort of see beginning, and that'll characterize the next 18 months in how this plays out. The first is a renewed period of crisis followed by diplomacy with North Korea, as I alluded to earlier. This is probably not going to look the same as 2017, but there'll be some similar characteristics. And I expect, unfortunately, at the end of the day, this will end with a tacit recognition, if not the public admission, that North Korea is nuclear armed and is going to remain so for the foreseeable future. The results probably won't immediately destabilize the situation, but this is going to set in motion a recalibration of strategic alignment in Northeast Asia, and potentially force some difficult discussions in South Korea as the 2022 South Korean election approaches, including rising demands for either U.S. nuclear weapons redeployment or a domestic nuclear weapons program. At the same time, Xi is going to face slowing momentum and increasing resistance domestically and internally in his assertive and aggressive approach to the region, as he finds that his heavy-handed approaches are netting near-term gains but leading to growing and domestic international pushback, as I alluded earlier. Xi's need for success, despite the pandemic's impact on economic growth, could result, though, in a less assertive foreign policy as we get deeper into the 18 months, and a greater domestic focus to meet economic goals for the 2021 first century 100th anniversary of the CCP's founding and the 2022 Party Congress I alluded to earlier, where he's going to try and launch an unprecedented third 5-year term, leading the party, the state, and the military. And then the third result I expect to see is that even though non-military U.S.-China strategic competition will be playing out globally and regionally in increasing complexity and intensity, and Korea and Taiwan will be central stages, I think there's going to be central stages for the struggle. There'll be increasing focus on Taiwan as the central venue where U.S.-China strategic competition takes on a more military-centric character. And given the fact that China's essentially digesting or has digested Taiwan or Hong Kong, Taiwan is likely to be viewed by both Beijing and Washington as the next logical venue for Xi to focus his efforts. And how the US responds in concert with Taiwan could be central in either escalating or de-escalating the situation, and either encouraging or discouraging Xi in this regard. Particularly, of course, as the island enters in 2023 jockeying for elections the following year to elect the successor to the current president. So that's my overall take. So it's not all bad news, but it's definitely not good news either. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Marcus. Okay, Halima, over to you, and I'll give you you can comment on what you've heard, or you can just go right into your view of how these trends are going to affect the geopolitics nexus with energy and global.
Well, fantastic. So it was quite a year first of all, thank you for having me at Columbia Energy Center. And it's so great to be back with old friends like Judd Devermont. I think we met each other about 20 years ago. So it's great to be back together. What's interesting is, when I met Judd, we were both working as analysts at the CIA. It was a period where US policymakers were very consumed with the idea that we were potentially reaching peak oil, that we were having a shortage of energy globally, and that we were looking at a period of sort of a prolonged higher prices that would have the US in a situation of dependency with key oil producing regions. And Nigeria at the time was seen as increasingly important in the wake of 9/11 because we essentially thought we would be getting more oil from Nigeria. And I think what's really important is sort of an overarching theme in terms of what has changed is really the role of prolific US production in terms of changing the game geopolitically. And we certainly saw that in 2019 when we had these spectacular attacks on Gulf energy facilities. Alan mentioned those. I was actually flying into Abu Dhabi, and we were landing, and it came across the scroll on the screen on Etihad that they had actually been attacked. They first set on Fujairah, which where I was headed to, that big port in the UAE, but then it was later attacks on tankers off the coast of Fujairah. And if you think about the summer of 2019, we had a series of attacks on critical energy infrastructure, the East-West pipeline, we had attacks on tankers, in the Straits of Hormuz, and then we had on September 14th, that spectacular attack on the Abqaiq facility, which temporarily knocked out half of Saudi Arabia's energy production. And, when I was sort of growing up in the IC and later at the Council on Foreign Relations and starting off on Wall Street, we always talked about Abqaiq as the mothership of the global energy system, the sort of the world's largest oil processing facility, the nerve center. And to have an attack like that linked to a sovereign state like Iran, you would have thought that oil prices would have been over 100. And the fact that we only had a pretty temporary rise in prices that quickly retraced once the Saudis said they could get production back offline, I think really speaks to what changed because of US production. And I was in the region right after the attacks. I was in Saudi, I was in Kuwait. And what was really a big central discussion there was, how has it changed US policy? When you have President Trump essentially saying, we don't need Saudi oil, we don't need Middle East oil. You had the Saudis saying, this is an attack on the world because it's the global energy system at risk. And President Trump said, no, this is an attack on Saudi Arabia. So I think that's going to be sort of an overarching question, regardless of if it's President Trump for a second term or an incoming Biden administration. What has the US production game changed in terms of our enduring commitment to the Middle East? Like, where is the Carter Doctrine at this point because of the growth of US production? Well, if you think about 2020, we thought starting the year at RBC, and I know other research analysts thought, well, we're going to be talking more about supply disruption, particularly right after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. The black swan obviously was COVID-19, which was the biggest hit to demand that we've basically ever seen. And what was so interesting was the sort of geopolitics of the response to COVID on the part of the oil producing states. I had been in Saudi Arabia right before that OPEC meeting in March, where the Saudis and Russians were unable to reach an agreement to shore up production. And you really saw the sort of geopolitical struggle playing out. I think the Saudis very much saw what was happening with the reports out of Wuhan through the lens of what happened with the global financial crisis with a potential hit to demand. They wanted to come in quickly and put in a floor. And I think they were also a little bit tired of the Russians having a veto at OPEC meetings when they essentially said, you're not even a formal member of OPEC. Why can you veto our decision making? And then you had the Russians essentially saying, we don't know enough about the ultimate impact of this pandemic, whether it's something that's just going to be Asia markets hit or whether it really is a global phenomenon. But I think underlying the Russian reluctance in March to basically put in a production floor was a view of certain leaders in the Russian energy sector. You know, Igor Sechin at Rosneft, he was tired of a situation where the Russians, you know, working with OPEC would cut production and essentially give room for the US to grow. And what that was enabling, what American energy dominance, as President Trump talked about, what it enabled was a very punitive US sanctions policy, targeting, as we know, countries like Iran, but also key energy projects in Russia, like Nord Stream 2, like targeting Rosneft trading for continuing to support the Maduro regime. And so I think the argument of Igor Sechin was, we need to deal a blow against not only shale, but also the sort of punitive sanctions policy that it enables. And I think that everybody essentially, particularly the Russians, but really miscalculated in terms of how serious the impact of demand would be because of the COVID-19 health crisis and the fact that storage was rapidly filling up. I don't think they anticipated in any way how sharp the fall would be and how severe the contraction in demand was going to be. And we essentially had two twin crises in the oil market. We had, again, this epic collapse in demand, but making it so much worse was this really, strong price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, where they essentially just opened the taps. And I like to use the analogy of the bathtub was essentially just overflowing. And we did see the real intervention of the United States when US shale producers made the call to the White House and essentially said, the whole American energy dominance story is at risk in current price levels. You need to get the Russians and Saudis back to the table. President Trump was someone who had been a harsh critic of OPEC from the beginning, and he essentially had to do a 180 when faced with the prospect of US producers going out of business. Not only were they big supporters of the Trump administration, not only were American jobs really at risk, but also the sort of foreign policy muscle that they got because of prolific US production. So if we think about where we are now, we do have this agreement between OPEC and Russia, providing, I think, an important support for the oil market right now. We've had an important recovery in demand driven by China's success in suppressing the virus. If you look at where we are in terms of vehicle traffic, in terms of flight data, like all the mobility indicators, China is really back to basically pre-COVID-19 levels of economic activity. The Chinese also were very opportunistic in the low oil price environment of backing up the truck and essentially filling their strategic stockpiles. But yet it remains a fragile recovery. It's been a recovery largely driven by China. We're starting to see some signs of improvement in Indian demand, which is very important as another emerging market that has driven oil demand growth as OECD demand has basically stalled. And so the question is, as we think about the coming 18 months, what happens with COVID-19? If we do get a return to global lockdown conditions, that could really derail any oil price recovery story. So that's a very important story for the oil market, just simply how does the trajectory of the virus evolve? What is the global coordinated effort to deal with it? But for these oil producing countries and for OPEC, I think there are other sort of key sort of micro issues to be watching over 18 months. I think it's going to be really challenging for them to potentially absorb additional barrels if we do get a return into JCPOA. And I'd love to hear Richard Nephew's thoughts on this. But if we did get a situation, were we to get a significant return of Iranian barrels, how would OPEC accommodate those barrels? There's also right now question marks of if the Libyan barrels continue to come on the market, who can absorb those barrels? And the tension between the producers, I think, will play out over this. I think Saudi Arabia is, willing to absorb those barrels and sit down more of those barrels to let these producers potentially back on the market. But there are other countries that just simply cannot cut more. And I would really highlight Iraq as a country that has been on the hook for the second largest cut in OPEC. And they simply are struggling now under the weight of the financial burden of low oil prices. And that's more, to me, another issue to really focus on is while oil prices have recovered to the low 40s, this is far below the fiscal break even of the vast majority of these producer states. And so when RBC sort of calculates the collective fiscal break even of OPEC plus Russia, you're looking at a collective fiscal break even, above $100 a barrel. And of course, there are big divergences within this producer group. You have countries like Venezuela, like Iraq, like Nigeria that really need, 90 to 100. You have the Saudis sort of in the $70 to $80 range. They can borrow, but certainly that is what's required to make it through the $40. You have to basically do budget cuts. You have to triple your VAT like Saudi has done. You have to tap the debt markets. So none of this is easy for these producer states. And then as we look out again over the sort of medium to long term, if we're thinking about a peak demand scenario by 2030, there's been a lot of debate. As I talked about, when I joined the agency 20 years ago, we're talking about sort of peak oil. Now the rage is peak demand, and people questioning, have we already reached peak demand? But if we think about this as something that we could be reaching in the next decade, there's certain countries that are well placed potentially to deal with the transition scenario. And then there are other producers that I think are really going to struggle with, economic and political and security challenges in a peak demand situation. I think the transition will be very tough for countries like Nigeria, for Venezuela, for Iraq. And Gulf producers are saying, well, look, we are best prepared to have the biggest share of a smaller pie because we have the cheapest and greenest barrels. And while the US and other producers will sort of fall by the wayside a bit in a transition scenario, but I think that will certainly be tested. And the willingness of populations to deal with budget cuts, deal with austerity measures, if we are in for a period of muted oil prices. So I think that's going to just be a big challenge for this whole complex. And again, a final question for the US will be, again, what is just the enduring commitment to the security of Gulf energy facilities? So with that, I will hand that back.
That was great, Alima. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a few minutes for me to ask questions, and then we'll go to the audience. I will stipulate up front that regardless really of whether we have a Trump 2.0 or a Biden 1.0, we're probably going to have a new set of national security decision makers just because the normal turnover that occurs after a first administration. Admittedly, the Biden team would bring back people that have had a lot of experience in government, but they've been away. So I'll just preface by saying I'm going to ask you questions that have to do with what you would tell a new set of policymakers, and you've all had experience doing that. So Alan, let me start with you. You touched on a bit of external activity in the Middle East by great powers. Do you think that if you were to net this out, that the role of the United States, Russia, Turkey, even Iran to a degree, what would you say has been the net effect of that involvement in either fueling fires or helping ease tensions in certain parts of the region? That's the first. It's a two-parter. That's the first one.
Okay. Well, I think the role of these external powers has significantly worsened the region's conflicts. Without the arms, the money, the soldiers on the ground that these powers have brought to the fight, I think there would have been greater opportunity to try to wind these conflicts down more quickly. And certainly Iran's effort to use these conflicts to project its own power throughout the region has drawn, for example, in Syria in the early years, a major response from the Gulf states who were supporting various opposition groups against the Assad regime to try to overthrow Assad and try to prevent Iran from gaining a victory there. And they poured money and weapons into the conflict in large quantities. And the result was, unfortunately, that they helped to basically fund and armed extremist groups who came to dominate the Syrian opposition over time. And as that conflict in Syria spiraled and the Islamist groups got stronger, ISIS, emerged kind of as one of the major players. And we know what happened when ISIS began to get traction in Syria as well as in Iraq. And we eventually saw the taking of Raqqa. We saw the capture of Mosul, which was the big event, and the move toward Baghdad. And the result being that the U.S. had to come back to Iraq to help restore stability there and defeat ISIS. So I think the Russians have Turkey has intervened in Syria 3 times now, mainly to go after the Kurds, but also to really get leverage against Russia and Iran in Syria, and basically kind of stake Erdogan's claim to a larger regional role. But Turkey's overriding concern is about a Kurdish autonomous region on his border. He's also concerned secondarily about more refugees pouring into Turkey. But yes, they have stoked these conflicts both in Libya and in Syria. And certainly by drawing Iran's presence in these countries, by drawing in Saudi and Gulf and other Sunni money and arms into these conflicts, both in Syria and Yemen, has intensified them, and has certainly worsened the humanitarian aspect of these conflicts.
So the second part of that is based on what Halima was saying about global energy trends. You could see an average American taxpayer wondering, and a new national security official wondering, what is the reason for the United States to stay engaged in the Middle East at this moment in time? There's a tendency, obviously, where we're pulling back troops from Afghanistan, with pulling back troops from Iraq. We have the huge deficit that we talked about previously. We have less of an energy reliance, at least for the near term. If you were asked by an incoming national security official, trying to get the right balance of U.S. involvement in the Middle East for the next 4 years, what would you recommend?
I certainly would recommend that kind of an intense kind of step back and a hard look at exactly what our interests are in the region. We've fought very expensive wars in terms of human life and resources in Afghanistan and Iraq, trying to change in Iraq, for example, trying to change the character of the region, basically, and also fighting terrorism. The result has been an Iraq that has been enfeebled ultimately, that is where the sectarian groups are still at each other and not reconciled. And by weakening Iraq as much as we did, we allowed Iran to really begin to expand its influence in the region. And we've been contending with that problem subsequently. I would say that all of the issues that drew us in, or many of the issues that drew us in over the decades, and certainly since 9/11, are less intense now. Certainly the counterterrorism challenge and the threat of terrorism kind of coming out of the region against Europe and against us is lessened. It's not what it was. So I think we need to think of how we deal with that with a smaller footprint, enabling local counterterrorism capabilities rather than trying to rely exclusively on our own. I think the issue of oil, as Halima mentioned, is going to be less of a core interest for the U.S., but it hasn't gone away completely. We have to think about the impact worldwide of global disruptions in global supply and oil prices. Certainly Europe and East Asian allies still depend heavily on the Gulf oil, more so than we do. So we can't ignore that, but I do think a smaller footprint probably is appropriate. I think a strategy of trying to rely more on allies and train them to deal with specific issues rather than simply providing them large, whatever large armaments they seek, the planes and the tanks would be more effective. The one thing I think that would be another issue that has always been a kind of a core interest of the U.S. is the security of Israel. Israel is much more able to take care of itself right now than it ever has been. It's certainly the dominant power in the region. So I think we need to re-examine the nature of our military and security relationship with Israel. It's much more of a partnership rather than major player, minor player now than it ever was. And I think the one big thing though that we need to think about is how do we deal with the issue of Iran and its activities in the region and its nuclear program. How do we contain and check that, but in both areas? One thing that I think was a mistake, if you will, was a failure out of JCPOA was that we didn't make it part of a broader strategic platform or framework that would link JCPOA to Iran's activities in the region, because we accomplished pushing off Iran's effort to acquire a nuclear weapon. I think that was done fairly effectively, but we neglected the fact that Iran was using the resources it was acquiring from lifting of sanctions to continue expanding in ways that threatened Israel and threatened our other allies in the region.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. And I'm sure with Richard, at some point, we'll turn in the next few minutes to the audience. Maybe we'll have a JCPOA question specifically. So again, we'll limit these like a couple minute answers here. Judd, I would be tempted to ask about the rise of ISIS in Africa, or the meddling of foreign powers in the region and its net effect. But if you were again asked by an incoming policymaker, or were one yourself talking to the American public, what is achievable in your view broadly in Africa with 4 years of steady engagement? Recognizing there are limits to resources and U.S. diplomatic attention and such, but a steady engagement in Africa over the next 4 years could achieve what?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist, which is kind of weird for someone who's a retired CIA officer or someone who's no longer in the intelligence community. But I do think there's some framing issues here, right? Like we work Africa for only Africa issues. And what I've been trying to convey to people is that if you think about it demographically, the population is going to double, right? From 1.3 billion to 2.6 billion by 2050. That means every global challenge will have an African dimension. It means that the things that happen on the continent do affect global politics. One of the reasons why Europe has moved towards ultra-nationalist, xenophobic parties is because of African migration, right? The way that we think about health security has to come out of Ebola. The way that we think about maritime security comes out of the counter-piracy efforts, and our ability to move money across our phones comes out of East Africa. So we need to think about Africa in this unified way with the rest of the continent, no longer siloed. And we also have to recognize that our allies and adversaries seem to understand that more than we do. And their efforts, as I mentioned earlier, is increasing while ours is decreasing or steady state. So I think there's a number of things that we could do over 4 years, but it has to start with a couple of basic principles. One, multilateralism. We can't do this on our own. If we want to do more in terms of infrastructure, if we want to do more in terms of fixing the enabling environment, we've got to do that with a host of partners. And right now it's all unilateral and so therefore largely ineffective. We've stopped engaging with civil society in a way that's meaningful. They are your guardrails on abuses, on corruption. If you want to talk about China and malign behavior, it's civil society. And we have to be doing more on democracy and governance. There's this debate in the African community, right, Mike, that's, well, are we elevating security? Are we elevating diplomacy? Are we elevating development? these aren't verticals, right? These are integrated. So I think we have to take a new approach towards the way we engage with the continent. I think that it's going to be incremental, but we have to change the way that we talk to each other, those of us who work in the Beltway, about Africa. And then we have to go another step and talk to the American public about Africa, how the continent matters and how it enriches local communities' lives. And without that, we'll just have a very small insular group of people who care about Africa that sit in these buildings in Washington, D.C., and the policy will look like it has for the last 2 decades.
Very good, Judd. Marcus, I know you want to talk about broader issues in North Korea, but every conversation we've had in the last 10 or 15 years has revolved around North Korea. So I have one quick question for you. We've tried talking and isolation and sanctions and not talking directly. And we've tried engagement and love letters and courting between leaders. And I don't know that we've moved the ball an inch on North Korea's willingness to give up its program, WMD. What do you think? What would you advise the new administration, which is going to have to deal with this, again, regardless of whether it's the continuation of Trump or a new Biden administration? What's realistic?
Yeah, so I would recommend to really have 2 goals, one very near-term immediate goal and one long-term goal. And I would suggest moving the idea of full, whatever formulation you want to use, complete and verifiable and irreversible denuclearization or fully verified final denuclearization, whatever that goal is, push it to where you're not pretending you can accomplish that within a single presidential term. Cast it as a long-term goal that you're going to remain tied to in terms of principle, but recognize that this is not something that you're going to pretend you can accomplish within just a few years, in part because, of course, North Korea, we know, is not interested in doing it. And they talk about it in terms that are also, very long term. So basically, you're talking about a situation where North Korea may give up its nuclear weapons at some point in the distant future when the security environment has changed, probably when the North Korean regime itself has undergone reform or change, perhaps even after Kim Jong-un is the leader of North Korea. So that's the first step. And then that clears the space to be able to focus on much more realistic near-term objectives. And I think the most important, most immediate objective is to prevent Kim from following through on essentially his threat that he made at the end of last year that was published very prominently in North Korean state media, that he no longer feels bound by his pledges not to test ICBMs or nuclear weapons. I think if Kim Jong-un proceeds with testing of ICBMs and or nuclear weapons, it will not only advance the capabilities of North Korea's programs and advance the credibility of their arsenal, but it will also have a really damaging effect on our ability to deal with North Korea other than in just a purely reactive mode. Kim Jong-un will be driving the train. It will be very difficult for us to have a coherent policy to think about other objectives other than total denuclearization that can be accomplished in the near term. And particularly if we don't respond strongly to punish North Korea, to make sure that it doesn't conduct that sort of testing and escalate it further, then it will just encourage more North Korean bad behavior. But the effort that we will have to make to respond then will essentially forestall any ability, I think, to have real good diplomatic engagement for some time. And that testing also will make it harder and harder, I think, to have an international consensus on how to deal with North Korea and to be able to coordinate efforts between South Korea, the United States, China, et cetera. So I think it's recasting and rethinking about first the very near-term objective and then the very long-term objective, and figuring out what you're going to try and accomplish through, I would say, a robust process within the next few years. I think that's the key to having a better strategy for North Korea.
Okay, Talima, and we're down to like a minute or two, so you did such a good job giving the broad overview. I'm gonna ask you a very specific question. It might be unfair. I don't know if you've ever worked on Venezuela, but as an old Latin Americanist, I've watched the decline of PDVSA for decades. And what I'm wondering is, we've all followed the loss of expertise, the politicization of the institution, the decline in investment. I know that China and Russia have at different points eyed Venezuela's resources with envy. But with what is the dynamic on the global energy market that you laid out for the next few years, What's the hope for PDVSA in Venezuela to have any kind of energy future?
I mean, I think of Venezuela much more as like a failed state, almost needing post-conflict reconstruction assistance than a situation like Iran's. When we talk about potentially bringing the barrels back, I mean, I think you can legitimately talk about if sanctions were removed, a rather swift return of Iranian barrels. I mean, as you mentioned, Venezuela has been a crisis that's multi-decade in the making. I remember, I mean, I was covering Nigeria at the time when we had Nigerian barrels off the market in 2003. We also had a Venezuelan oil strike as we were potentially heading into the Iraq war. We'd lose more barrels. As you know, after the Venezuelan oil strike in 2003, thousands of PDVSA employees were fired, left the country, and that was the first big hit to technocratic competence. It has been a downhill path, I would argue, since 2003, and simply accelerated under Maduro. And so when we talk about what it's going to take to get Venezuela back up on its feet, I mean, one of the biggest issues in Venezuela is the debt crisis. It's one of the most heavily indebted countries in the world. And when you talk to debt restructuring experts, they say it's going to be the most complicated debt restructuring ever undertaken. It will dwarf Greece, dwarf Argentina, will have to be led by the international community. And so I think those are the big first order issues if you want to talk about getting Venezuela back up on its feet. The energy sector is going to require billions of dollars in investment, again, to get it back up on its feet. So even if sanctions were removed, you know, I think it's gonna be a long way back for Venezuela. So I don't see it as this sort of immediate issue for the oil market in terms of getting a big supply chunk back on the market. I think it's going to be a long haul back, and I think it's going to require the international community to work together to get the country back up on its feet.
Excellent. Okay, Richard, questions from the audience?
Yes, and we're quite fortunate. We've had a number of questions come in, so I'm going to try and consolidate a few of them so that way we can get at the salient points across a number of different panelists. I think this one's best for Alan, Judd, and for Halima, and you'll see what I mean in a second. What is the impact of decreased fossil fuel use in the next decades on the Middle East, particularly with regard to security issues? Nigeria in particular, folks were interested in whether or not there's any evidence that Nigeria is starting to plan for a post-oil economy. And then to Halima in particular, what are some of the most promising approaches that will motivate global petrostates to start thinking about and planning for a post-oil world?
Who wants to go first? Alan.
Let's make a couple of comments and then really turn it over to Halima for talking about kind of the oil market and bigger picture issues there. But I think that I would just cite two things. One is that the Gulf states already see the writing on the wall, and we've seen Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia trying to implement his Vision 2030 to diversify the Saudi economy away from oil. And he's been trying to model that after the relative success that the UAE has had in developing itself as a banking, trading, tourism center, and as well as an oil producer. I think that the problems that we're seeing Mohammed bin Salman run into in making that transition portend real challenges for the oil exporting states over the next decade, to the extent that they're really have built everything around fossil fuel production and export. And to the extent that their economies decline, I think secondly, their ability to support poorer countries in the region will decline. And so I think the negative effect is going to be, at least in the near term, fairly traumatic for the region.
Okay, Halima.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you think about what the MENA oil exporters were taking in, you know, pre-2014 price collapse. I mean, those countries' oil export revenue is over $1 trillion. Now we're projecting that the MENA oil exporters are going to take in this year $300 billion. And so it's been a spectacular collapse in revenue. And I think, as Alan pointed out, there's certain countries that saw the writing on the wall early. I mean, I think Vision 2030 was all about the idea that you cannot rely on oil revenue to fund your state in perpetuity. I think absolutely UAE was quicker on this as well. I look at not just the diversification efforts, but also what their sovereign wealth funds have been doing in terms of investment in renewables. I think about the fact that the UAE is host to the International Renewable Energy Agency. I think about the type of investments that sovereign wealth funds like Mubadala have made in, investing in Chinese ride-sharing companies like Didi, battery technology. So I think they're starting to think about how do you use your sovereign wealth funds to sort of fuel diversification, thinking about, the uptick in renewables. But I think there's a whole class of producers, and this sort of dovetails into Judd, that are just ill-prepared for this transition. And I do think this is sort of a policy priority that someone like Fatih Birol at the IEA is really sounding the alarm about, is how do we get ahead of this? Like, how do we prepare these states for a coming energy transition where they could see their hydrocarbon revenues really decrease? And how are they prepared politically and economically to make the transition? They've been told for years they have to transition, but it's proven so challenging and so difficult. And again, I worry most about a country like a Nigeria. And so with that, I'll hand that over to Jed.
It's never a good position to follow Halima on oil. So I think that this is a government crisis of the first order for Nigeria. But I think as an economic crisis, we can be a little more nuanced. So Nigeria's government revenues based on oil are 80 to 90%. So that means the entire political class is built on sort of how do you share that oil. In terms of the total country's GDP, it is no longer a majority oil sort of economy. And so that means that there are some states like Lagos who may be able to weather it a lot better than poor Jigawa in northwest Nigeria, which depends on oil. So I think you'll have a political crisis and government crisis of the first order, and you'll have much more of a patchwork when it comes to different states who can either weather that storm or not. But I think to Halima's point, at no level have they done what you need to do to transition. So very little diversification. They still can't refine their own oil anyway. And then for the countries that actually have revenue that is non-oil, Nigeria is one of the lowest domestic revenue mobilization in the world. So they're actually not even taking advantage of the base that they have that's non-oil. So a series of challenges for Nigeria. But I do think it's important to make distinctions between the government and a more diverse or growing diverse non-oil sector.
Okay, Richard.
Great. And then we've got a question for Marcus. Can you foresee a scenario in the next 18 months where a major anti-access area denial operation in Northeastern Asia could so severely affect energy transportation that it prompt a US-China conflict? And this is suggested in the context of China's defense of its right of development and the broader implications of energy and its importance to the Chinese economy, particularly in the current context.
So that sort of scenario would be what we like to call on the Nick a low probability, high impact scenario. I would say, sure, there are ways this could come about. I don't think it's very likely. As I mentioned in my comments, I think both Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un want to push boundaries, but not intentionally start a war. But there's always the potential for miscalculation. And so I would see a conflict, whether it's North Korea or China or both fighting against the United States or allies in the region. I think you're going to see the disruption of supply chains, the disruption of energy flows. I think a full-scale conflict involving either of those countries will show the tremendous reach that they have, and then also the tremendous concerns there's going to be about potential for such a conflict to go nuclear. But I would say that is definitely in the category of a low probability, high impact scenario, not one that I would say is something that we should focus on personally.
And perhaps in another low likelihood, high impact scenario, a question for Halima. With the concentration of natural gas markets that is anticipated involving Russia, Qatar, and Iran, do you see the possibility of a natural gas OPEC emerging anytime soon?
No, I mean, there are these sort of gas forums, but every time you talk to Russians or Qataris, you don't hear any sort of uptake for the idea of a sort of gas equivalent of OPEC.
And now a question that I think will actually touch on everybody. So, one of a couple of questions that all kind of came in but clustered towards the same is the requirements of rare earths and other rare materials for global renewable energy technology. And at the same time, that there's also a drive for deglobalization of supply chains. There's competition for rare earths. And so the questions that kind of emerged were, what are the impacts of these various different trends on your regions of concern? And I'll say there was particular interest in South America. I don't know that we've got a particular South America expert other than Mike on the line, so we might be able to get him to answer this question as well. But the question is, first and foremost, what would be the impact of the need for renewable energy technology, which is going to be at the forefront in the future, and the materials required for that? What's that impact going to be on regional competition and global trade? And then what's the impact of deglobalization in supply chains on your regions?
William, you want to go first?
Actually, I think this is a great one also to pass to Marcus, because so much of the discussion about the geopolitics of renewables is how much of it is made in China. If we think about sort of, lithium batteries, the control of the supply chain, the sort of refining process for that, the control sort of rare earths, relationships with countries that produce critical resources like cobalt in the DRC. And so I do think in terms of the broader policy discussion, a lot of it is going to be about China's control of the sort of supply chains of renewables and what is the geopolitics around that. So I'm actually going to kick that to Marcus.
Fair enough. No, I've actually spent some time thinking about this. I mean, overall, I think you may recall the whole rare earths issue coming up some years ago. And as with some of the other phenomena that I described where China gets pushed back when it overreaches, I think an effort by China to exploit that phenomenon that was just described about how much of this comes from China would actually undermine China's then ability over the long term to have that. So it's something that that has potentially a short-term opportunity for leverage, certainly, and it's something that maybe is kind of be held over the heads of some countries and some companies, and particularly the potential that a short-term supply interruption could be really problematic for a nation or a large company that really relies on, or even a small company that relies on these materials and these technologies. But in the end, I think that the more that China would try and squeeze on that and leverage it, the more it would cause companies and countries to take advantage of opportunities to source these things elsewhere. And I think a big part of the reason, from my understanding, and maybe Alina knows more than I do about the subject, is the reason that China has an advantage in this area is because of price, not because of inherent systemic advantages that China has. And so if China starts to do things that end up driving up the price or reducing the supply, the world will adjust, and China will lose influence as a result. So it's one of those things, as I think many things with China, is that the threat and the perception is actually much more useful than the reality, because once they exercise that threat, the response actually undermines China's position. So maybe that's an optimistic view, but that's my take on it.
Judd or Alan, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would just say that, this is for Africa is a Democratic Republic of the Congo issue. And so there's a whole sort of problems with that in terms of how much this will be another enclave economy that could, move that country in the wrong direction. For those of you who don't know, this is the site of Africa's First World War, where 9 different countries had deployed to get access to, at that point, diamonds. And so China has, I think, some inherent advantages to operate in this space in Congo that American companies can't, and our tech companies are trying very hard to be on the right side of corruption laws and labor laws and not fueling conflict. But I think operating in the Congo, where a lot of the cobalt and tantalum and all of these rare earths is a real challenge that I think it is an advantage for China, a disadvantage for us, and probably ultimately a disadvantage for Congo.
Alan, you got anything? Yeah, and from my perspective, I started working on Latin America in the early 90s and stayed engaged in it through the 2015 period. Look, I think the economic crisis of the day, with COVID in Brazil expecting a 9% contraction, Mexico higher, is going to be the near-term focus for the foreseeable future. So I just looking past that, I think is hard at the moment. It's just such an overarching challenge. Good.
Great. I think we've got time for a couple more. So this one is definitely for Alan. What's your opinion of the Israel-Arab reconciliation deals on regional stability and peace? And then a related question is, are more coming? In particular, people are very interested in Saudi-Israel reconciliation.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that they are a contribution to regional stability. The building of normal relationships between Israel and the Arab states, I think, is a positive. It's going to benefit them economically. Certainly, a country like Sudan, certainly a country like Bahrain, and the UAE, they will all benefit from the economic relationships and open defense relationships with Israel. As far as the impact on peace, I think that's going to really depend on a couple of things. One is whether these countries, for example, particularly I think the UAE has some leverage here, and certainly the Saudis would if they decided to move, to use normalization as a way to extract some movement from Israel on peace with the Palestinians, for Israel to make some concessions that would draw the Palestinians back toward a willingness to sit down at the peace talks. I haven't seen any of the states pursuing that yet, and I think it's going to be an interesting question whether any of the future states that seek normalization with Israel do that. Right now, I think obviously the big losers are the Palestinians. I think both just in terms of the fact that this breaks up the Arab solidarity and on behalf of the Palestinians and not formalizing relations with Israel until Palestinians get their state, but also because of the way the Palestinians have reacted, which I think is they're really locked in an old mindset and really haven't adapted themselves to this new reality. As for who's next, I think that if Mohammed bin Salman had his way, he probably would normalize. I think King Salman is not going to be willing to do that, at least for now. I think certainly a country like Morocco might be in the offing at some point. But Saudi is the big one. I think the key in terms of a peace process would be the Saudis kind of using the Arab Peace Initiative language and that, Arab states are willing to fully develop relationships with Israel in all its aspects once Israel has withdrawn from the occupied territories and Jerusalem, and there is a Palestinian state that at least shares Jerusalem and so on. Using that as leverage would be a powerful tool to try to bring the two parties together. But I think the other element that's needed is a U.S. approach that, frankly, in my view, is more balanced between Israel and the Palestinians. I feel like the Trump administration is tilted so far toward Israel that Israel has little incentive to make concessions right now.
Maybe I can just jump in on that, Richard, because I'm particularly troubled by the way that the Israeli normalization was inserted into the Sudan transition process. I mean, Alan can speak about what it means for the global sort of Israel policy, but we are in the midst of this important transition to get them off the state sponsor of terrorism list, which has been a deterrent to get real economic investment in this country, and a designation that they had no longer had been qualified for. And at the 11th hour, this stipulation was, well, you have to recognize Israel if you want SST. So I think that it was a distortion of a tool it's problematic in the Sudanese context. So lots of opposition have opposed it. They didn't really want to do it. I mean, so it should be used the way it needs to advance the whatever the Israeli-Palestinian peace process is. But I fear that it's going to keep cropping up in non-Israel Palestinian issues and become the primary issue of the bilateral relationship. And I could talk about this in other contexts too, but Africa is getting, big-footed on a bunch of stuff right here. And the Sudan one was really problematic.
Okay, Richard.
All right, I think we got time for one more, so I'll make it a nice and easy one. What are the prospects for improved U.S. transatlantic ties with Europe over the course of the next 5 to 10 years? And the questioner notes that there's been a bit of a policy of disengagement. There certainly are more fault lines that exist now than existed maybe 10 years or so ago. Is this a temporary phenomenon or a long-term phenomenon? And I think this might be one for you, Mike, or maybe Halima as well.
So I can start. The prospects for U.S. transatlantic ties over the next 4 years?
They said 5 to 10, but I think if you can even say the next year, that would be a pretty big statement.
Yeah, look, I think the next year, you have to get past the next year, right? Because the next year is still going to be the fallout of COVID. You saw the reaction of, I think it was the Germans and the French yesterday having to revisit a shutdown. Ireland had to shut down again. I think the next year is going to be messy because of COVID and all of the implications of that. But getting past that, I think our interests are so interconnected. A lot's going to be shaped by what our approach to Western and Eastern Europe is as well. But I just think there's a natural gravitational pull for that relationship to be constant and fairly steady, within the 40-yard line, so to speak, over the next 5 to 10 years. There's so many common interests. There's so many emerging challenges. I think the world's going to be a darker place if the United States and Europe don't have a improving relationship. Halima.
No, I have actually nothing to add to that. I mean, we can talk about particular energy projects, but in terms of the broader relationship, I think Mike did it so well.
Okay, Richard, anything else?
Oh, we've got at least another 40 questions, but I don't think we've got time for them.
We'll get one more. We got 2 minutes.
One more? All right, I'll see if I can make it a real good one then.
After that, I have to pay Judd overtime.
So the next one is a maybe a very problematic one, but it's a country actually we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about, which are prospects looking at Russia. Obviously, the conflict between the United States and Russia that potentially has been simmering for the last several years, but simmering depending on who in the United States you talk to is very real. We've got the prospect of a new administration coming, but we also are still going to have challenges notwithstanding what happens in the election next week. So the question is, where do we see U.S.-Russia relations going over the course of the next few years? And I'll just add on top of that, this does connect back to some specific energy projects, and it certainly relates back to the potential use of sanctions and other tools to help channel and manage some issues with Russia.
Yeah, I think, look, I've written a bit on Russia when I was at CFR. There's a lot of inherent structural problems that Russia faces right now, right? It's probably a 4 to 6% GDP contraction this year. It doesn't grow more than 2 to 3% even out through 22. It's still hugely reliant on oil exports for, as a percentage of GDP. There's all the issues with corruption. There's all the unrest in the Far East periodically. I think there are areas where we might be able to have a relationship with Russia, internationally, that would be for the betterment of the globe. But I think we need, we need to identify where we can cooperate and not expect it to be uniformly positive, because it won't be. There'll be areas where we challenge. The question longer term, of course, is where is Russia post-Putin? But I'm not sure when that post-Putin era is going to emerge. So that's just a broad overview of it. But Halima, why don't you end us?
No, I mean, bringing it back to energy, I think that it's going to remain a fraught relationship. I don't see any backing off efforts, particularly if it's a Biden administration, to sanction key energy projects like Nord Stream 2. I was on a panel in May with the Russian oil minister, and he was talking about the new congressional efforts to sanction Nord Stream 2, citing Ted Cruz. It's been now become a bilateral issue. And I think sort of over the long term, it's an interesting question about is there a diminishing return on these type of sanctions? I just interviewed Dan Yergin last week about his book, and he talks about the Yamal LNG project and basically a sign that if Russia could get that project off the ground, post 2014, does China provide a way for Russia to sort of circumvent these sanctions efforts? So I think that will be a big story going forward. But again, I think the energy relationship and the sanctions are going to remain on these projects. And again, it's going to be a fraught relationship.
Okay, Richard, do you want to close this out or you want me to?
Over to you, sir.
All right, I think as we talked about in the beginning of the panel, there'll be a full video recording of this available, I guess, in the next few days, Richard. And then for a calendar of upcoming CGEP events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. So thanks to all my panelists and friends. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of the day. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.